Hello, and welcome to session C2, Heritage Site Management. This panel focuses on the balance between visitation and historic integrity. I'm Megan Borthwick with Historic Hawaii Foundation, and I'll be introducing our panel experts, Spencer Leineweber and Thomas Woods. Spencer Leineweber is the chair of the graduate professional program in the School of Architecture at University of Hawaii. Her professional work includes the restoration of many heritage sites, including Hawaii's Plantation Village, the Uchida Coffee Farm, the mission stations at Honolulu, Hilo, and Waioli. Difficult technical and functional solutions are found in her work, which includes the restoration of historic architecture, new construction within historic districts, design guidelines, and technical reports. Spencer received the Frank Haynes Lifetime Achievement Award in 2013. Tom Woods is the Executive Director of Hawaiian Mission House's Historic Sites and Archives. He holds a PhD in American Studies. On the mainland, he has worked for the Minnesota Historical Society, where he became head of Historic Sites Department, overseeing a system of 31 historic sites. In the 1990s, he left there to serve as the director of Old World, Wisconsin, before creating Sense of Place, Inc., a museum consulting firm. Before accepting the position of executive director of Hawaiian Mission Houses in 2010, Tom had served as a consultant for historic sites in Hawaii for nearly 20 years, directing several major planning, research, and interpretive programs. Thank you both for being here today.
Oops. Aloha, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to speak about when enough is too much, the balance between visitation and integrity. It's important to balance visitation and integrity, and it's possible to project certain numbers to support operations and maintenance, and that's certainly the first thing that most sites do. They go, how many people do we need to get in here to pay everybody? And it's often difficult to look at just numbers of money or amount of money and try to equate that with visitors. So how to get the effective number of visitors for your site needs some careful study. The numbers of people impact staffing, it impacts the kind of experience your visitor may have, and it impacts your resource, your historic resource. So the numbers are really an important thing as part of the visitor experience. The capacity at a historic site depends on man, and in Hawaii we have Anana man. Everything was built to certain dimensions of the human being, and heiau, halepili, kalo planting was all to the dimensions of the human. Well, the same is true today in historic sites. The person and body dimensions, particularly certain parts of the body, are very critical to heritage management. How much space a person takes, you need to know. So what is that space? How much do people take up? It depends on what they're doing. So this chart on the right is Edward Hall's personal space bubbles. Edward Hall was a social anthropologist. He studied how people relate to each other, and he was particularly interested in different cultures having different space bubbles. So I'm sure you've been with someone in an elevator who gets a little too close to you. Well, that's a cultural issue. How close someone can be to you varies by cultures. So that intimate space is usually about 1.5 feet, sometimes a whole lot closer, but that usually doesn't happen. Intimate space does not usually happen in a historic site, at least we hope not. The social space, this next sort of outside of personal space, is several people together in a space, and that's usually about 4 feet to 12 feet. That's most of the common dimensional space that you're using in a museum or a heritage site. And then public space, where there's basically people can do whatever they want, and that varies to about 25 feet. So the distance between people is cultural, but each culture has also each of these layers of Edward Hall's space bubble. What people do also requires different dimensions. The activity influences the space that they'll take up. So Heather showed the same slide this morning. This is actually the first Hawaiian language tour at Iolani Palace. So a person just standing, if you're not going to do anything else, is about 5 square feet. So you can fit a lot of people when they're not doing anything but listening. But once they sit down, they actually need more space, about 10 square feet. And then once they're sleeping, hopefully not at your sight, and these guys sort of look like mummies here, but I know this is a heritage conference, but I don't think we have any mummies in Hawaii. Sleeping or doing other activity takes even more space than that, about 20 square feet per person. Why is capacity important? Because it impacts patron mobility, how they can get around in your site, the integrity of the patron experience. How would you like to have traveled 8,000 miles to Paris and have that close a view of the Mona Lisa? Not getting any closer because there are way too many people there. They sold too many tickets to see her. And it also has an impact on the condition of your materials, particularly the historic finishes at your site. Too many people causes problems in all levels of integrity, the experience as well as maintaining the site. There's also a variable capacity dependent on activity and age. Different groups, age groups, have different space requirements. The age and mobility of the person impacts the space that they will take. Children need more space. Can't you see those little umbrella heads twirling in that space? I can. They need more space, and you need to allow for that in terms of the capacity that you take on. The elderly also require assistance going in and out. If you're trying to do a timed tour, you have to allow for the elderly to get down the stairs. I'm feeling more like that every day. Mobility impairs certain required sizes and slopes. You have to have a certain slope if you're trying to get people down in a wheelchair. And you have to have certain stability markers for the aged moving through your site. And this requires future planning as well as appropriate staffing. Codes also impact capacity, although I found that the building codes actually are much more generous than the reality of the situation. And they also change the historic resources. So these are historic stairways in the frame house. I think you still go up that tour that goes up those stairs. So these are difficult stairs to go up even if you're young. So steps, grab bars, emergency lighting, all of those things are important in a historic site to make mobility smooth. So the higher activity, more space is less people. Needs more space and less people. So the ramage press on the right-hand side here, you can see it in about 5 minutes. But if you're actually printing the spelling binder, the spelling bee, with school children, it can take an hour. And so what you're doing in the space, how you're doing it in the space, who you're involving in that activity also impacts your capacity. So capacity impacts materials. Those nice bushes on the left-hand side are eaten by deer. They don't grow back. That does not grow back. You can also have activities on historic exterior spaces that impacts the ability of the grass to grow ever back. The key is to protect the resource and still allow the integrity of the patron experience. The body wants to make an experience as well as the mind. There's voluntary contact and I think involuntary contact. I'm sure this gentleman probably drove a Jeep like that and he wanted to put his hand around the wheel again. And so that is an involuntary reflex of wanting to touch something. And Heather talked this morning about her little signs everywhere that like get moved because people want to touch the table underneath where she's put the sign. And that's almost an involuntary reflex. And so you have to allow for that in terms of how you move people through your site. You have to manage the impact of the desire to touch. So protecting the resource, people and property. Too many people, everybody wants to touch everything. Where somebody touches something, they leave finger oils. And those finger oils, Tom will tell you how often you have to take them away. The body contact by visitors is typically feet first, hands, and then other parts of the body that sometimes you have no control over. The visitor backing up and touching your resource with the cantilevered portions of their body. That you have to control, and you can control it only by the capacity of the number of people that you have in the space. So how do you protect that resource? You create a renewable replacement. Now, Heather's probably not going to want to weave her rug in the throne room because that was an expensive enterprise, but that is a renewable resource because it's an artifact that is a reproduction, and a new reproduction can be made. Or you can limit where people go, runners up the historic stairs to protect the koa finishes, but then you have to replace the carpet runner if that wears out. And you can see here the beginning of deterioration of that reproduction carpet runner. So you can stop people if you don't want them to go up or go into certain areas by stanchions to control people from going everywhere that they might want to go. So protecting the resource also requires resource. Heather also talked about her booties this morning, and those booties do protect the floor. You can see the damage on the floor from before they had the booties. But those booties also require staff time to take them out, shake the little rocks that are on the inside of the booties, and refold them and put them back in the baskets. And so you have to allow for staffing time to protect the resource in a sort of larger context as well. So why space capacity is important is because you need to protect the experience as well as the resource for all of our futures. On the left is children playing outside at Hawaiian mission houses, and on the right, researchers in the archives. Both of these experiences are important at Mission Houses Museum, and I think you can see that the managing of those resources produces an experience that all people want to have, and so you need to project that for the future. Thank you.
I think we have a branding problem with a member of our board. I just heard 3 names for our organization. The last slide. Mission Houses Museum, Hawaiian Mission Houses, Historic Site and Archives, and Hawaiian Mission Children's Society. They're all the same. They're all us.
No,
Yeah, you did. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about creating a historic site cyclical maintenance manual and plan. And much of what I'm going to talk about comes from a project I did. You can come up and look at it later for Vesterheim, or the Norwegian American Museum in Decorah, Iowa. So one of the things that you got to watch out for is apocalyptic collapse, right? If you've got too many people jammed into your space, you're going to have some damage. That's not actually what happened here. This is the Washburn A Mill at Mill City Museum in Minneapolis. But what did happen is, as they were planning to create a museum in this mill, in 1991, some homeless people started a fire in it to keep warm and burned the mill down. And but now they've gone ahead and created the historic site, and they've restored, quote unquote, or I should say preserved the ruins. And it's really a very interesting site because it is a ruins, and there's much more associated with it, but it's a very interesting site. So okay, the slide on the left, what's wrong with that picture? When you're thinking about it from a maintenance perspective. Is anything wrong with that? What's growing on it? Okay, you've got vines on the one on the left and the one on the right, or the building on the left, and then the building on the right is full of moss. And that's, and of course you see that dense shade around it as well. And you have moss on the roof because the roof never dries, because there's too many trees around it keeping the sun off of it. You're going to have a leaky roof in both of these buildings very quickly, because that vegetation is going to put holes in the cedar roof. Okay, what's wrong with the picture on the left? The milk house at the Jacobson Farm in Decorah. Anybody? It's losing, it's sort of leaning to the right, isn't it? And also you can see loose siding on it. So basically and what's happening is that it's in a snowbank also. So the snow of course is blowing into it, and the exterior is against moisture all the time. What about the one on the right? Rust. So what? Is rust a problem? The thing about that building, that's the Kuriba and the Hoshidana at the Kona Coffee Living History Farm, or Uchida Farm. And that's an example of really rehabilitation. What they did is they had some holes in some of the roofing material on there, but what they did is they found similar kinds of material in existing buildings, scrap, and they put that similar material back on the structure. So when you're talking about authenticity, this is a very, very authentic place. And it is maintained well, it doesn't leak, and so it doesn't always mean replacing material with brand new material. And they also had it done by older Japanese coffee farmers. So the same sorts of skills were used to replace some of that. This is a project that Spencer worked on as well. Okay, so as I said, much of my presentation will be coming from this cyclical maintenance manual and plan. And there are those two parts, the manual and the plan. They're very distinct. So beginning with the manual, I don't know if you can see this table of contents, but I think it's important for you to get a sense of what's included in it. First of all, the purpose of this is to identify what the building systems are that you're going to look at, and also to give you some sense of how you're going to investigate it. What are you going to be looking for? So, for instance, the building systems are the site conditions, the foundation systems, the structural systems, the exterior walls and appendages, roofing, gutters, and waterproofing, windows and doors, interior finishes, mechanical systems, electrical systems. Okay, so you look at that stuff, but what are you looking for? Well, the best place to go to get a sense of how to restore, or what problems to look for in those systems, and then how to restore them, is the preservation briefs. The Department of Interior preservation briefs. And there are over 50 of those available right now, and they deal with every kind of structure and every part of the structure. So they're incredibly useful. And then you also have to think about the standards, different standards of restoration, including rehabilitation, restoration, or rather preservation first, rehabilitation, restoration, reconstruction. They all involve different kinds of work on the structure. So you have to be real clear what your goal is in working on that structure. Okay, then the next part of the manual is the plan and the checklist. And this is a design that was based on the Humphreys Poley architects' work that they did in 2006 for the Colorado Historical Society. first you have to establish a baseline. And that baseline basically involves describing the structure. This is just a template that you can use to plug in your photograph of that building in the right corner box. And then you give an introduction. What is the building's name? Where's the building located? Who designed it? Why is it significant? So a general description of it, its general history, description of the current use. Is it designated as a landmark or as a historic structure? What's the building's timeline? When were certain things done to that building? And then the footprint of the building. And this is an example of how you would build out something like that. So this is the Amdahl Odland Heritage Center in Decorah. So you've got the introduction that identifies where it's located, when it was built, what it's used for now. And then you have a statement of its historic significance. Why is it being preserved? What is significant about it? And then you have a timeline of that building, the original construction date, different owners of the building, and you have information about the building size. So here you have all of your information together in one place. How many times do you have to go looking through all of your documentation to find that bit of information that you need at a particular moment? Well, here it's all together. And then really, it's a process of systematic inspection and observation. So looking at the building on the left, this is a really important building in Minnesota. This is the Lower Sioux Agency Warehouse. It's where the Dakota War began in 1862. When the Dakota were starving because they were waiting for the government payment to be made in 1862, their food was stored in the warehouse, but the cash payments had not arrived yet. And American Indians were asking, the Dakota were asking for a distribution of the food at least, and the agent wouldn't do it because the rule said you can't distribute the food until the money arrives too. And so his response to the tribal group was, let them eat grass. And that was the start of the Dakota War. He was later found, he was one of the first people killed, and he was found with his mouth, dead with his mouth stuffed with grass. Now this building has been meticulously restored, but notice that the gutters are disconnected now. Look at the very base of the building. You see the gutter on the ground right next to the structure, and then if you see at the very top, the left side on the roof, the gutter has been thrown up on top of the roof too. So it's probably a result of high winds and but what happens when you have water splashing back on a building all the time when your gutters are disconnected? Well, something like has happened at mission houses, on the annex or the print shop. You see that pillar there that supports the lanai outside of it. Constant water that has been splashing up against that has rotted both the anchor and the metal anchor as well as the wood itself. So what you have to do is divide your systems into different categories and then look at them individually. So you have categories like walkways and handrails, driveways, alleyways and lots, landscape elements, foundation, the building structure system, the envelope, walls, roofing, your windows and doors, and then all your interior finishes, your architectural features, your mechanical and plumbing systems, electrical, life and safety. So very systematically divided into systems, and then you're ready to start doing an inspection. So once you've identified those categories or those systems, you have to look at, you basically create a checklist. And first of all, you look at the item. So this is within the landscape category, for instance. An item may be your grade drainage. Is the soil next to the structure sloping away from the building or toward the building? Of course, for proper drainage, it should be away from the building. When I first arrived at mission houses, there was an irrigation system right alongside the foundation of the building, and because there were plants there, and it was actually almost like a gutter that had formed along the foundation. Now, if you don't have any problems with water in your basement, if you don't have a basement, then it's not a problem. If you have a basement, though, and you have frequent water intrusion, there's probably a reason for that. If you're irrigating right alongside the foundation of the building, that's something that needs to stop. So we did take that system out, graded it away from the building, and put some coral rock alongside of it. So next you have to look at, of course, the task, and then frequency of inspection. How often do you have to look at that item? For example, semi-annually, annually, or weekly. And then note the condition. Is it satisfactory, unsatisfactory? Is it a critical action that you have to take? And then specify what needs to be done. I wanted to put a whole page for you so you get a sense of how this works out. I don't know if you can read that in the back, but so the first part is walkways and handrails, and so you can see that's divided into concrete walkways, brick and stone walkways, gravel walkways, handrails, wooden walkways. And then there's a task under each. And this comes from those preservation briefs. That's how you know what to look for in those categories. So look for uneven surfaces, ponding, or growth from the joints, plants growing up in the joints. For gravel walkways, look for erosion or uneven surfaces and ponding. So you look to the right, you've got W, M, Q, S, A, and S, T. So W is you inspect it weekly, M is you inspect it monthly, Q is quarterly, SA is semi-annually, A is annually, and ST is after a storm or before a storm. And then satisfactory, unsatisfactory, and critical. So when you go down, they all have the same sort of organization with different things to look for. Okay, so it's basically, you can get it a sheet on a clipboard, or you can have this whole system even better on a laptop or an iPad or something like that, and you go out and start your inspection, and you can do it right on the site. So what I've done is this part on the bottom is actually extended on the right, but I wanted to get it on a little bit bigger so you could see it. So you write down your name, whoever's doing the inspection, and then you can see the extension at the bottom is the date of the inspection, what asset or what was the location that was inspected, and then the item that was inspected and the task. Stone foundation walls, examine for moisture stains, cracks, spalling, failing, or missing mortar. Okay, so then you do the condition description and then identify action required. And then the next piece that's off of this is action taken that you would also record. So here again, an example of a building system. System inspected, building structure system, brick-bearing walls, check for cracks, missing or loose mortar, and bricks, be sure the walls are straight and true. Stone-bearing walls, check for cracks, the same kind of thing. Now you can use this for any kind of structure, including stone structures, or you can use it for grass halle. It's the same sort of thing. You just build in different characteristics, different areas to look at. Okay, so after you've done all of your inspection in a systematic way, then it's really important to have a detailed maintenance history in one place. That is something that we so sorely need. I haven't done yet at mission houses, is go through all of your records historically and figure out when different things were done at your historic site and put it all in one place. Keep a record. And this is all done on Excel. You can use different software that works for you. But these are simple things. This is just an example from the Decor project. It wasn't the result of research, it was a result of their director telling me when things were done, and I just put them down. But these should really be more specific. And for instance, just something like paint. If you painted your structure, what was the paint code? Put it down. What was the kind of paint that you used, and what was the formula? Those things are so important. I've been running around trying to find that stuff from years ago, and you just can't find it sometimes anymore. So that's really critical to keep up with all of that. So basically, that's it. It's just a matter of identifying the steps that you have to take and then creating something to implement all of your work. So you have to create an annual facilities maintenance plan. So you've done your inspections, and so then you look at all of those issues that need to be done, and then you try to figure out, okay, what can we do this year? And you create an annual facilities maintenance plan based on that. And everybody knows you always have to prioritize things because you don't have enough time and money to do it. And so you look at, first of all, I think the health and safety of staff and visitors. Secondly, the building envelope and your structural integrity. Thirdly, security and environmental stability of collections. Fourth, the non-envelope and structural integrity. And then finally, a program necessitated site repair and restoration. I hate it that program is always last in everything, but if you don't have a structure that is solid and stable, program enhancements aren't important because you're going to have that apocalyptic collapse someday or something close to it. So then once you've looked at that, then you begin to prioritize your projects within those levels, such as replace a non-functional drinking fountain with one that is capable of being turned on and off day and night to prevent the homeless from bathing in it and damaging it again. It is important for staff and visitors to have water available outside. So you identify what the problem was, and you identify what you're going to do to resolve that problem, and then you have an estimated cost. And then what we do is we submit the annual facilities maintenance plan every year to our facilities committee, which Spencer happens to be chair of, and then they approve that or suggest changes, and then it's presented to the board for our annual budget. So those are the basic steps in developing a cyclical maintenance manual and plan, and it's really useful and will work on any kind of historic site. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom and Spencer. Do we have any questions from the audience? No questions right now? Okay, I have a couple questions. What role does visitor education play in balancing visitation and historic integrity?
I think we both can answer that because I can look at it from the impact on the resource. I think educating the visitors in terms of the resource that you have is really important so that they don't back up into a historic whitewash, because they'll not only get it on their butt, they'll also destroy the whitewash. So I think talking about the resource in terms of the finishes that are there, it's not just interpretation of the story, but also the building in terms of my point of view.
Yeah.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay. Any audience questions? Oh, we have one over
Megan's
here.
really prepared here.
Do you encourage self-guided tours because of that issue? I mean, if you're worried about people, would you discourage self-guided tours?
That's a really important question that we are still struggling with. One of the things that is true about historic sites, and especially historic houses, is that really, in spite of the fact that heritage tourism is on the rise, visitation to most historic sites and historic houses is on the decline. It's sort of an irony. How heritage tourism is defined is the question. And because historic site, it is true that historic site visitation, except for some local sites that are getting millions in, I know, Pearl Harbor, of course. But in general, historic site visitation has been declining. And some of the reasons that people are talking about that, and in fact, historic houses especially, are in crisis right now because the decline has been so significant that some of them can no longer operate, and there's all kinds of strategies for actually moving them out of historic museum status that are preserved for public visitation and into, in some cases, individual ownership or custodialship or something like that, where perhaps they have public access occasionally, but they're being used more as houses now than historic museum homes. So there's all kinds of work within the historic site and historic house field trying to figure this out. Now, one of the problems that is identified as a decline in attendance is that people don't like to be in a guided tour format because they want to have choice. They want to spend time looking at what they want to look at, what they're interested in, and they feel trapped when they are in a historic house and they have to follow behind the guide and listen to everything the guide has to say and get out of the house when the guide wants you to get out of the house. So how do you build choice into it? I mean, you can do it easier, I think, in a big structure like the Palace, but it's difficult with a small New England historic home like Hawaiian mission houses, because they are very small spaces. And so the answer to your question is we don't do self-guided tours yet inside the house. And one way that you could do that is to have people stationed throughout the house so that there's somebody with close to every room, basically, so that they can provide information and also to protect the objects. But we don't have the money to do that, to pay people, and we wouldn't be able to recruit enough volunteers right now to do that either. So it's a real conundrum, and we're struggling with the exact right formula for that. Right now, we don't allow self-guided tours.
So I think the self-guided tour is an important issue because it allows the choice for the visitor to stay in one room for a really long time if they want. But that doesn't mean that you don't have staffing, because you have to have monitor staffing in a self-guided tour. Like Tom said, either you have somebody in the room that is there to answer questions, but I've been in the Palace where those people that are listening on their audio, whatever you called it, back up because they're trying to look at the painting, and they back up and the person in the room that was supposed to be watching people absolutely grabbed them before they hit the railing. And you have to have that kind of watchdog in a room if you're going to have people doing what they're choosing to look at for how long they want to look at it. You still need the monitors in the room, maybe not as many as a tour, but you got to monitor it.
And the other thing related to the crisis in historic houses right now is, I mean, people want to get involved. They want to interact with something, and they want hands-on experiences whenever possible. And that relates to the question of, spending time where they choose to spend in a historic house too. So the difficulty is, we are developing hands-on activities in different rooms, but then the length of the tour begins to balloon too. And so how do you control that? And not everybody's going to want to stay in the same place, so for the same length of time. And you have to have security for your objects. There's just and your structure. So it's a difficult question. It's something that's been being debated right now by the entire historic site industry.
We have some more questions.
Yeah, how do you make a decision about how far back you go?
How far back you go?
Yeah, because at one point it was new. And to what point do you restore it?
So that typically a building is restored to its period of significance, and that you have to look at the entire story of the site and choose the period of significance, and that typically is the period that it's restored to, but not always, because sometimes there's a range of periods of significance, and I think the look at what's the most important period has changed over time, because we're trying to tell more of the story rather than this sort of one moment in time.
There was another question in the back too.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say that I do have a historic home that I did restore, and I now run a bed and breakfast. And so that's another alternative. And I have people going.
And do you have a maintenance plan?
I'm here. It is a constant maintenance problem.
More questions? I have a couple more. Does this approach to balancing visitation and integrity change based on settings such as an archaeological site, a museum, or archives?
Yeah, it does. And you have to evaluate what your resource is, and then what kind of demand on that resource is. In an archival setting, for example, so many more things today are digitized. So that would be the first encounter with an archival experience, would be to look at the archival material in digital form first, and then you can still look at the actual document. But there's so much wear and tear on documents, and there's arguments over whether the white gloves are useful or not. And so I think the retrieval of information in archives is changing, and I think that's for the good of the archives.
So the question really becomes is not if you divide up how many hours you have in the day and how much space you have. It's not just how many people can you cram through in those hours and within that space, because the maximum number of visitors that you can accommodate should also be measured against the integrity and stability of the resource over time. So we all want. Most of us want more visitors in order to get more earned revenue and in order to get more grants and all that, because we still play a numbers game. Foundations still play numbers games. And they want to see how many people are impacted by their dollars. And so does the state, and so does the city and county. But that's not always the best measure, and it's not always good for the resource either. So somehow there has to be a balance there.
Thank you. I have another question. Is there any more questions from the audience? Oh, here's one.
Based on our luncheon speaker, why couldn't you raise your entry fee considerably to give the impression that this is truly a valuable experience, and then make it an encounter, an experience? So do you have where women are like cooking in that kitchen? Like how difficult would it be cooking in that kitchen in those days? So they actually have that encounter that we've been talking about this. I'm just kind of leaving the stories we've heard from the other speakers today.
No, we're actually developing a lot of experiences like that. For instance, we're just doing a domestic arts room. We have all small rooms in the house, but we're in one of the bedrooms, we're creating a domestic arts room because domestic arts were something really important that missionaries were trying to teach Native Hawaiian women. And they did it. It was an act of cultural imperialism. They thought that New England culture was superior to Hawaiian culture. And so, of course, they thought it was also about sexuality and different attitudes toward sexuality between Hawaiians and New England Congregationalists. And so they wanted to teach Native women how to sew clothing to cover their bodies. And so it's a really important theme to interpret at mission houses. So in that room, we're going to have like hand sewing opportunities. We're going to have needlework like a sampler. Samplers are really interesting because it's a little object, but those little objects did several things. They taught, for instance, needlework skills. They taught morality because most of the time they had biblical sayings or some sort of moral sayings on them, and also they incorporated often Hawaiian language. They're often done in the Hawaiian language. So just the simple act of having a visitor take a few stitches in a sampler or teaching them, doing workshops in sampler making helps to impart an important theme. Other things, we're going to have a mu'u in there and have people be able to take some stitches on that as a way to, again, convey that theme of the mu'u is a perfect example of that whole concept of differences in sexual attitudes. But ironically, the Ali'i women really wanted to have that New England clothing because it set them apart from the Maka'ainana as well. It gave them status, initially at least. So they were each meeting different needs in wanting a mu'u. So in that one room, we can build in all those themes. Also, we're going to have a small loom in that room, and talk about the missionaries encouraged the Hawaiians to start a textile industry. And in fact, on Maui, Kuakini did build a textile factory in the 1830s, and they were going to use native Hawaiian cotton, and native Hawaiian women were going to be the laborers, just like in Lowell. You know, it was a New England textile factory idea. Didn't work very long because the Ali'i found out they could buy the fabric cheaper than they could make it in the factory. So the idea of the kitchen is something that Spencer and I are talking about, but we're not quite sure whether or not the restoration used all fireproof materials. And there was an incident back in the 90s when they began a cooking program in the Chamberlain House. And I think with visitors in there, as the chimney heated up, it exploded plaster out across the room. That's not something we want to see happen. So we have to be very careful about that. But I agree, the smell of bread baking in the beehive oven would be a wonderful enticement. I keep telling Spencer that we had 9 operating kitchens at Old World, Wisconsin when I was director. We never had a problem.
So I fall down on the conservative side of fire in a historic structure. And so you have to weave a line that tells the story appropriately as well as protects the resource. And that's not an easy thing to do. So he's always wanting to cook, and I'm saying, no cooking, not yet.
I'm working on her.
I have a question. How do you think signage is to get to the historical sites here in Hawaii versus on the mainland? There's all these nice brown signs that kind of show these are the historical sites or these are the attractions that you can get to. Because in Hawaii, I don't think there's enough signage to get people to these sites.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And Heather is actually president of the Hawaii Museums Association this year. And it's also just awareness of historic sites. And she's working on a project, Heather, raise your hand so people can see, is working on a project to create a brochure that at least, and maps that at least identify historic sites around the islands so that people know they exist. And then I think that clearly the wayside signage is really bad. I mean, it's very difficult to find historic places, I think, in Hawaii in general.
As well as like heiau as well too.
Absolutely.
If there's a heiau there, not just a sign that says it's a heiau, at least an explanation of what the heiau was used for, general information, because people will just look at it and go, even locals, they pass by it every day, there's a rock wall, and they don't have the appreciation of what it's actually there for.
So you're talking about both directional signing and interpretive signing, right?
Any more questions from the audience? Okay, thank you, Tom and Spencer. Please join us in room 311 for the closing session, which is starting at 2:15.